Well, one of the things that also happened, and I would like to get number two, and that when I first went back there, there's one gentleman from the press that immediately wanted to know who I was, even before, long before the Fortune article, long before anything. His name was Gordon Elliot White. Now, Gordon Elliot White represented the Deseret News. He was what you call a stringer. He had about 4 newspapers that he represented because these papers couldn't afford to have a full-time person. So they each, these 4 would happen to have agreed to let Gordon Elliot White represent them. But usually the big issues he could use with all 4, just had to kind of adapt it to fit the particular market where these 4 came from. Gordon Elliot White couldn't believe that I'd come out of nowhere. With no experience, I mean, there is no way. It cannot be done. It's impossible. But nevertheless, he was intrigued. So we had 5 years go by, and this one was written June 17th, 1970, the Deseret News. And what this is Utah Doug Snarr wins. That's what it says. Doug Snarr wins. He was way premature. What he believed, that once Volpe had agreed and the White House had agreed, I had him. And by cracking that trust fund, that was the way to go. No question about it. Now, one of the reasons I'd like to discuss that trust fund a little bit more. If I had tried to do it without the trust fund, every year you'd have to go before the Congress to get money appropriated to continue to pay. They'd only pay outside of the trust fund year by year. And that would mean before Congress. But you get into the trust fund, the way the trust fund is structured, you wouldn't have to ever go back. That would be up to the administration to determine how the funds are to be spent. That's how it was originally set up. Because how could they build an interstate system that if you have to keep going back every year to get money? So you have Barack Obama comes along and screws the works up, for example, or whoever it might be. No way. So the trust fund means that once that it kicks in, it's there. And so he says here, Utah Doug Snarr wins. I'll read just a tiny bit from this article. When the Nixon administration unveiled its highway program last week, Utah Doug Snarr had won a pretty impressive one-man victory. For all the inertia, big money interests, entrenched power, and alleged unresponsiveness of the system, Snarr proved that the force of one small man can be felt in Washington. Then it goes on to say that I developed this program, and the program that I had developed is basically this. It was figured out that for every dollar that would be appropriated to remove billboards, 2/3 of that would be spent in red tape and paying bureaucrats and governmental employees. The sign companies would get 1/3. That's the problem with government. It eats up the money before the benefit goes out to the people in so many programs. Well, I saw through that, and I developed a method. For example, in Utah, there were, and throughout the whole state, 22 sign companies. They owned 10,000 signs. And the way it was set up by the government to implement the program, they take a little section of road, then we would take and praise each one of those signs on this little section of road, depending upon how much money we had, would determine the size of the section of the road. And then they would take and go through probably upwards to 50 pieces of paper by the time you're through with each sign. 50. And I had figured that out by working with the department, Utah Department of Highways. I had the information, how that would be implemented. So I said, forget about that. All you do is have one negotiation with each sign owner. So that would be 22 negotiations against 10,000 signs in Utah. And the 10,000 signs in Utah, it would take years to do it. In the meantime, the companies are destroyed, they're strangled, they can't use the money to any advantage because it just dribbles in. Give them the money in one big shot and have the companies take their own signs down. The government can't take them down, right? They'd have to get a warrant to get in there on the property anyway. Well, sign owners have a lease. They can get in there on their own. So you save money there, just all the way down the line. They take 5 people, 2 trucks, where the sign company can do 2 people with 1 truck. And so everything is more efficient, more sensible. Well, that was my position. Okay. It says, Snarr moved in on this capital, fighting an apparently futile fight. So when I started, my effort was futile. And one of the reasons was because I had more of an enemy than just the House Public Works Committee, period. Who was that second enemy? It was the biggest sign company in America, owned by Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, 3M. They had 60,000 signs in every state in the Union. And they just took the money they needed and donated to every one of those campaigns in that House subcommittee on roads, and they were all bought off. But it also paid for a belief to support what they originally said: we want to maintain the fidelity of this program for roads, for highways only. So there was another side to the story. Most important of all, the money could come from the huge Highway Trust Fund, which does not require congressional appropriation. So once they agree to crack, you never have to go back to Congress ever again. And the administration then can just take and put the money out there in these states, which is allocation. I've explained that to you. Authorization, appropriation, allocation, and appreciation. There's 4 A's that are involved in the process of getting a sign down. And so anyway, that's been already explained to you. And I'm kind of nice to have this little article. 81 years of age looking back. And when I went back there, I was still in my 20s. I was in my late 20s. So just a little tiny kid, basically, compared to all these other guys. Through it all, Snarr has been the force that has kept the effort going. In a capital that has lately been labeled unresponsive, Doug Snarr's example shows that patience, work, and persistence by just one man can still get through to the United States government. So I just had to reference that article. I believe I learned more from Gordon Elliot White, giving me a kind of a big picture, as particularly special early on, than anybody else. Because I always ask him the question, What would you do if you were me? That was the most, gosh, used question that I asked during all those years, because it put them in my shoes and it pricked their conscience. What would you do if you were me? So then he'd kind of give me an idea where to kind of go next. I mean, he really did help me a lot. And he helped me before I met Kay Danes. And Kay Danes, it was a combination of working with both. But from then on, it was mainly Kay Danes, more so. What I want to achieve today is verification. That's why I'm referencing these articles. It's verification that that what I say can be supported, every word, with an article evidence that I am telling the absolute truth in this interview. And that I'm making these interviews for my family, and hopefully, maybe 100 years from now, I don't know, they'll know that there was a guy named Doug Snarr in their family line. The Department of Transportation, you got to see it, that you got on top, that's John A. Volpe, the secretary, and they have to oversee everything in that department. Airports, everything that's being done in transportation across the United States. It's huge. But they spend more money than any other department with the exception of defense. Was right there. And that committee on public works, again, only one committee is above them in the amount of money they handle, and that is defense. In those days. Now that's changed. Health is second. Kind of a tragedy, I think. There was an article that came out in the Washington Daily News, and I kind of like this, and about my situation in July 17, 1970. This is written by William Stife. This is a Scripps Howard staff writer for the Washington Daily News, and they have newspapers all over America. It said this, that Snarr has spent more than $170,000 on the support of his bill. Well, that's what it cost me mainly for airplane trips back and forth, and my rent, and so on, and taxi cabs and everything else. I did not donate to any of the campaigns. None. And it says he's made 37 trips to Washington since his first one in April 1967. Now, it also says Mr. Volpe became Mr. Snarr's most enthusiastic backer. I couldn't have a better one. There's another name that has come into this. I've talked to you about George Washington, Jr., the General Counsel for the Department of Transportation, first black man to get a degree at Harvard Law School, first one. He was wise. I love that guy. The second one was one that I named George McInturf. And I want to talk about one comment that George McInturf made. You got two parts. You got the top, and then you got the bottom. And in the bottom is the Bureau of Public Roads under Frank Turner. I've talked to you about him. The man that Eisenhower chose to build the interstate system, to oversee it. And he'd been there for 42 years. He knew where all the skeletons were. He immense power. Well, they had set up an acting national beautification man. and his name was George McInturf. He was a former FBI guy. He was an attorney. Something about him. He gave me the willies. I don't know why, but he was always saying nice things about me. To my face. I didn't trust him. Just the way I felt. He said this: "It's good to have an ally like Doug Snarr." This was in the National Observer, Monday, August 24th, 1970. 1970 was a huge, huge, important year. "He's beating people over the head for us. For years we fought a losing battle with no one in our favor. The conservationists, which is the environmentalists, were against us for just compensation provisions, just taking steel aside. That's the environmental movement. I hate them. I hate them to the core because they're not honest. The outdoor advertisers were against us because they thought we wanted to wreck their industry. Well, it was going to be wrecked, no question about it. Now I sit back and watch Mr. Snarr fight, and to me it's great." Says Mr. Snarr, "I used to be a slugger. I've won about 100 fights, and boy, I'm ready for this one." But anyway, so there's McInturf. Now, then the next thing that happened was about the best thing of all, and that was, here I was one day. I go down to work, and they're sitting in front of on the street, 16th Street, just off Scott Circle, is my yellow Chevrolet Suburban. And in it is Carol at the wheel, and there's all 4 of my children, sleeping bags, the whole works. Carol just said, "I just can't stand it any longer." Now, to drive around, she can't even hardly make it to the grocery store unless you can, because she doesn't have the confidence of being able to figure out how to get to places. That's not her forte. So Brooke, 12 years of age, my oldest, took a map, probably a series of maps, and he took her all the way from this house right here on 4728 Deer Creek Road in Salt Lake City, and ended up in front of the apartment on 16th Street in Washington, D.C. And there she was. She never told me she was coming. There she was, waiting for me, because they got there early, to come out of the door. And there they were, all smiles and everything else. It was absolutely transcended everything. Most important thing, in many ways. But she got an idea real quick of how involved I was, but her role was the children. She was there. So Brooke's job was to figure out where they're going to go every day. They're not going to just sit in the apartment and stare. They're going to take advantage of it. We went to all the memorials, on and on they went. One of the things we just loved the most, practically, that in the summer, and this was during that time, and they were there for, ended up being there for upwards of 3 years. It was great going to the Capitol in the evening and listening to the Army band one night, and then the Navy band, and then the Marine band, and then you've got the Air Force band. All different, led different. They're all dressed according to whatever field of endeavor they were involved in the armed services. Great uniforms. It was fantastic. Well, they ended up in this one-room apartment with sleeping bags. This apartment isn't much bigger than just right here. And it was all there. We got this little place with a refrigerator and a little sink, and that was about it. And with a little hot stove, tiny electric thing. They had one little bathroom for all of us. Oh, brother. And it was great. Carol put a little sign out there, God bless, God bless our family. She put it on the door. And it was during this time that it got out in the news that we were all crammed in to this one-room apartment, the whole family. And I had been working to try and get this bill through Congress for all these years. That I get a phone call from Dan Rather. Now, Dan Rather was the bureau chief for CBS at that time. Later on, he replaced Walter Cronkite as the #1 newscaster for CBS News, which in those days was the #1 news program on television, period, by far. Well, Walter Cronkite was amazing. Dan Rather was a bulldog. So he comes up there, brother, and interviews us. Well, when he got there, I wasn't there. So it was Carol and the kids. But he had enough on me from just looking up all these articles that come out on me. And I've referenced earlier that all of a sudden, after the fortune and everything else, and after it got out that Volpe was on my side and the White House was on my side, I was attacked, literally attacked, by these newscasters of all kinds from all over the country wanting an interview. But this was big-time stuff. Now, the story goes that they broadcast this show in the Walter Cronkite news series. My mother just happened to be, had the television on, and she saw it. I have never seen it, but she saw it. And when she saw it, then it was over with. She ran to the phone, phoned the local station, and wanted to know if they could play it again. And, well, they can't. Want to know if they had a copy of it. Well, they didn't have a copy of it. But she got excited. I'm glad to see that in her. I really am. I never did really tell her much. I didn't tell my family what was really going on. It was too complex, and I didn't have the time. It just was too much. I couldn't do it. She was too much of a different generation. But it boiled down to this, that my battle was with, in the final analysis, with the House Public Works Committee, but the biggest of all was Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing. They were bitter. They were after me. They wanted me out of the picture. And in a way, I felt threatened, and I didn't feel totally secure around them. Now, what happened was that the House did not support me. And this was a critical year. 1970 was a critical year to get this program through Congress. And so when Volpe put the program into the federal highway program, that's why Gordon Elliot White said Snarr has won. And in a way, he was right. I had won. It was only a matter of time. But the House did not go along. And the reason was they were all willing to go along and crack the fund except one man, George Fallon of Maryland, the original person who helped set the Highway Trust Fund up originally. And he said, no, we will never, ever, as long as I'm here, we'll never allow you to crack the Highway Trust Fund. So I lost. But the year still hadn't run its complete course. Fallon, every 2 years, like every other congressman, is in an election. He'd been there for years. And a young upstart in Maryland, out of Baltimore, challenged him. And we were involved in a Vietnam War, and he wanted peace, this young upstart, and he defeated Fallon. So therefore, even though they said no, there will be another year. But I know that we have to have it now. And here is the edge that we had over them all. Fallon was weakened. So it was understood that the person who would replace him was a man named John Blatnick. John Blatnick is from Minnesota. That's where 3M's from, Minnesota. So I had mixed feelings. Oh my gosh, I'll just go pay him off and I'll be out of business. This thing is going to go on forever. How can I ever win this thing? And just keeps going on and on and on. The catch was this, that when they originally set this program up, the interstate program by Eisenhower, and the trust fund, it was for a period of time, and they figured that it ought to be reviewed in 15 years. So the 15 years was up. And the 1970 Federal Highway program and the fund, the bill for that, was up to be reviewed. Well, you're not going to get that reviewed without the approval of the White House. And you're not going to get that program reinstated without the White House and John A. Volpe of the Department of Transportation. So we had leverage. And what they wanted was to crack the fund to use for removal of billboards. So there had to be a compromise here. Even as stiff and as tough as that House was, if they get too tough, all they'll say is, well, we're not going to sign the bill unless you agree to the removal of billboards and the beautification of America. So that was the battle. Blatnick was going to replace Fallon. He's been on the committee, too, a long, long time. Refused to take a position. So he excused himself from voting. He excused himself from even participating because eventually, it's only a matter of time, they're going to have to meet with the Senate and then work out the differences. And the Senate and the House are going to have two different bills, but they got to come together in conference, it's called, the conferees, which is all done silently. No one knows. They keep it secret. It's a secret. All the people know is what comes out of conference. And so it's a very, very unique situation with the Congress in that context. Well, Fallon is going to be gone. And Snarr and Volpe in the White House has the edge. And the key is the imminent expiration of the interstate program, and all of a sudden we have got lever. Give me a lever long enough and I can move the world, the ancient Greek saying. Now, in addition to that, Volpe had been calling the chairman of the board of 3M. He had been calling the president of 3M. He wanted them to participate in this process. He was willing to listen to their ideas, and so far he had gotten nowhere. They held out. We will not take a sign down. So a meeting was held. This was a big meeting. And in this meeting, what you had, and I'd like you to hand me the next one, William Stife, who writes for the Washington News, Daily News. He also writes for all their papers, one of which is the Rocky Mountain News in Denver. He tells this story that I think is amazing. Volpe, this week, set up a meeting of his chief assistants with National Advertising's 2 lobbyists. So National 3M had 2 lobbyists there. I'll bet you in today's money they're paid $250,000 every year. Easily. And these guys were real pros. Name, Chris Halverstein and David Reedy. And 2 Western billboard owners. Douglas T. Snarr of Salt Lake City and Louis Gregg of Boulder, Colorado. He had joined with me. He knew I was right. He had 2,000 signs in I figure about 6 states. Mine were in 13 states. Who want the government to fulfill blah, 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 past that. In the room were lawyers, 1 for 3M and 1 for Snarr and Gregg. And of course that was William K. Daines, the J.C. Penney attorney, missionary in Great Britain when I was there. Just one of those wonderful things, but as smart as they come. He represented me. And at least, it says, and 2 for Volpe. So you had Joe Bosco and they had 2 attorneys for Volpe, the high level. Now down below that level, and at least 3 other Volpe advisors. Those are those others. So the purpose of the conference was to try to reach a compromise to make sure Volpe and his team knew exactly what 3M wanted. Now, this is the way it happened. It was a 2-hour meeting, maybe a little over 2 hours. One big table, much bigger than that table there, huge table. So there they were, 2 with their lawyers, 3. So now we had all these guys. So there was myself and Gregg, and next to me was my attorney on my left. And then there was Joe Bosco representing Volpe, which is the same as having Volpe there, actually. And then he had the general counsel's assistant, and then he had the George McIntyre from the Bureau of Roads and their attorneys. Well, here's the way it went. Bosco introduced everybody. Then he sat down and turned the time over to them. And they started to talk. And they went through all kinds of, well, we got to have scenic areas where you can have no signs. Well, the scenic areas were so, they couldn't name one, but they were just talking, you know, it was just baloney. We've got to have these scenic areas. So after they get through talking, the 3M guys talked directly to Bosco. They ignored me completely. So all Bosco would do is when they were through talking, he'd just go like this to me, and I had to answer. So it went like this from them to Bosco. He refused to answer, turned it over to me, and I'd answer. So it boiled down to the battle between 2 of them against, actually 3 of them, against myself and my attorney. My attorney would only deal with the legal issues only, which wasn't amount much. They didn't hardly amount to anything. But it was great to have him there at my side, and I appreciated that. So that was the battle, back and forth, 2 hours. That was it. And when it was through, they did not agree to remove one sign. And I knew I had won that battle with them. The Volpe had the ammunition he needed to proceed, and he could always say, I gave him every chance in the world to come to the table, maybe work out a compromise of some kind, whatever it might be. They had no ideas, not one. It didn't amount to anything. Unworkable, just verbiage. Talk, 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 but nothing to it. Now, this is discussed in number 7, and if you've got it there, right here, I've got this right down here, and I like what it says here at the end of this. The secretary doesn't care who knows that he has come out swinging. He came out swinging. And it brings out exactly what I've described to you, how it worked. And I was starting to get very, very confident that we're going to survive this. Even though they've turned the bill down, we can still beat them because Congress is still in session. And they might have to, if they get into the conferees with the Senate, we got all the weight on our side. And it's just everybody in the world against that little committee and their conferees in that conference that would yet to take place.